Good morning. Welcome to English Mirror. Today we analyze NORTHROP FRYE's essay, The Archetypes of Literature. Let's begin. Initially, he was a student of theology and then he switched over to literature. He published his first book, Fearful Symmetry, a study of William Blake in 1947. The book is a highly original study of the poetry of Blake, and it is considered a classic critical work. NORTHROP FRYE rose to international prominence with the publication of Anatomy of Criticism, published in 1957, and it firmly established him as one of the most brilliant, original, and influential of modern critics. Frye died in 1991. On the whole, he wrote about 20 books on Western literature, culture, myth, archetypal theory, religion, and social thought. The Fables of Identity, Studies in Poetic Mythology is a critical work published in 1963. In the essay, The Archetypes of Literature, Frye critically analyzes literature against the backdrop of rituals and myths. He interprets literature in the light of various rituals and myths. Frye has divided the essay into three parts. The first part deals with the concept of archetypal criticism. The second part throws light on the inductive method of analysis of a text. The third part focuses on the deductive method of analysis. All the methods fall under structural criticism. The concept of archetypal criticism. The term archetype means an original idea or pattern of something of which others are copies. Archetypal approach is the interpretation of a text in the light of cultural patterns involved in it, and these cultural patterns are based on the myths and rituals of a race or nation or social group. James George Frazer and Carl Jung are the two great authorities who have greatly contributed to the development of archetypal approach. Frazer was a social anthropologist, and his book, The Golden Bough, makes a study of magic, religion, and myths of different races. Jung was a psychologist associated with Freud. The collective unconscious is a major theory of Jung. According to Jung, civilized man unconsciously preserves the ideas, concepts, and values of life cherished by his distant forefathers, and such ideas are expressed in a society's or race myths and rituals. According to Jung, civilized man unconsciously preserves the ideas, concepts, and values of life cherished by his distant forefathers, and such ideas are expressed in a society's or race myths and rituals. Two types of criticism and the humanities. There are two types of literary criticism: a significant and meaningful criticism and a meaningless criticism. A meaningless criticism will not help a reader in developing a systematic structure of knowledge about a work of literature. Philosophy and history are two major tools for interpretation of literature, and archetypal criticism is based on philosophy and history of a people. Archetypal criticism is meaningful criticism. Formalistic criticism and historical criticism. Formalistic or structural criticism will help the readers in understanding a text only to some extent. That is, a reader may understand the pattern of a text, but how the pattern is evolved, he cannot understand without the background information, which may be called historical criticism. Structural criticism will help a reader in understanding the pattern of a text, and historical criticism will make the reader's understanding clearer. What the readers require today is a synthesis of structural criticism and historical criticism. Archetypal criticism is a synthesis of structural criticism and historical criticism. Literary criticism is a science. Literary criticism today has become systematic in its analysis, and therefore it could be considered as a science. Part 2. The inductive method of analysis. Structural criticism and inductive analysis. Towards the close of the first section, Frye contends that structural criticism will help a reader in understanding a text, and in his analysis he proceeds inductively. Historical criticism and inductive analysis. Under the second type of criticism, called historical criticism, a critic interprets the birth of a text and resolves that it is an outcome of the social and cultural demands of a society in a particular period. Thus, the historical inductive method of criticism helps the readers in understanding not only symbols, images and myths, but also the very genre itself. Archetypal criticism and its facets. Archetypal criticism is an all-inclusive term. It involves the efforts of many specialists and at every stage of interpretation of a text. It is based on a certain kind of scholarly organization. An editor is needed to clean up the text. A rhetorician analyzes the narrative pace. A philologist scrutinizes the choice and significance of words. A literary social historian studies the evolution of myths and rituals. Part 3. Deductive method of analysis. Rhythm and pattern in literature. Literature is like music and painting. Rhythm is an essential characteristic of music, and in painting, pattern is the chief virtue. Rhythm in music is temporal, and pattern in painting is spatial. In literature, both rhythm and pattern are recurrence of images, forms, and words. Rhythm in a work. The world of nature is governed by rhythm, and it has got a natural cycle. The seasonal rhythms in a solar year are spring, winter, autumn, and summer. This kind of rhythm is there in the world of animals and in the human world also. Works of literature have their origins in such rituals, and the archetypal critic discovers and explains them. He explains the rhythm of the rituals, which are the basis of literature in general. Pattern in a work. It has already been established that in literature, pattern is recurrence of images, forms, and words. The four phases of the myth. Every myth has a central significance, and the narrative in a myth centers on a figure that may be a god or demigod or supernatural being or legend. Fraser and Jung contend that in the development of a myth, the central figure or central significance is the most important factor, and many writers have accepted this view. Frye classifies myths into four categories. The first one, the dawn, spring, and birth phase. There are myths dealing with the birth of a hero, his revival and resurrection, defeat of the powers of darkness and death. Subordinate characters such as the father and the mother are introduced in the myth. Such myths are the archetypes of romance and of rhapsodic poetry. The second, the zenith, summer and marriage or triumph phase. In this phase, There are myths of apotheosis, the act of being raised to the rank of a god, of sacred marriage, and of entering into paradise. Subordinate characters in these myths are the companion and the bride. Such myths are the archetypes of comedy, pastoral, and idyll. Third, the sunset, autumn, and death phase. These are the myths dealing with the fall of a hero, a dying god, violent death, sacrifice, and the hero's isolation. The subordinate characters are the traitor and the siren. Such myths are the archetypes of tragedy and elegy. The fourth one, the darkness, winter, and desolation phase. There are myths dealing with the triumph of these powers. The myths of floods, the return of chaos, and the defeat of the hero are examples of this phase. The ogre and the witch are the subordinate characters here, and these myths are the archetypes of satire. Literary criticism and religion. There is a close relationship between literary criticism and religion. In his analysis, a literary critic considers God as an archetype of man who is portrayed as a hero in a work. Frye then proceeds to explain two visions of life. One is comic vision of life, the other one is tragic vision of life. In the comic vision of life, in a myth, the human world is presented as a community, or a hero is portrayed as a representative of the desires of the reader. Here, the archetypes of images are symposium, communion, order, friendship, and love. Marriage or some equivalent consummation belongs to the comic vision of life. In the tragic vision of life, in the human world, there is tyranny or anarchy, or an individual or an isolated man, or a leader with his back to his followers, or a bullying giant of romance, or a deserted or betrayed hero. In addition to these, there will be a harlot or a witch or other varieties of Jung's terrible mother in the tragic vision of life. In the comic vision of life, in a myth, the animal world is presented as a community of domesticated animals, usually a flock of sheep, or a lamb, or one of the gentler birds, usually a dove. The archetypes of images are pastoral images. In the tragic vision of life, in the animal world, there are bees, birds of prey, wolves, vultures, serpents, dragons, and so on. In the comic vision of life, in the vegetable world of a myth, there is a garden, a grove or park, or a tree of life, or a rose or lotus. The examples of the archetypes of Arcadian images are Marvel's Green World and Shakespeare's forest comedies. In the tragic vision of life, in the vegetable world of a myth, there is a sinister forest like the one in Milton's Camus, or at the opening of Dante's Inferno, or a heath or wilderness, or a tree of death. In the comic vision of life, in the mineral world of a myth, there is a city, or one building, or temple, or one stone, normally a glowing precious stone. These are presented as luminous or fury. The example of the archetype of image is a starlit dome. In the tragic vision of life, the mineral world of a myth is seen in terms of deserts, rocks, and ruins, or of geometrical images like the cross. In the comic vision of life, in the unformed world of a myth, there is a river, traditionally fourfold, which influenced the Renaissance image of the temperate body with its four humours. In the tragic vision of life, this world usually becomes the sea, as the narrative myth of dissolution is so often a flood myth. The combination of the sea and the beast images gives us the Leviathan and similar waterborne monsters. Frye introduces W. B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium as a befitting and famous example of the comic vision which in the poem is represented by the city, the tree, the bird, the community of sages, the geometrical gyre, and the detachment from the cyclic world. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the video, please share and subscribe.